Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the September edition of the Northwest Gas Association's monthly webinar series featuring Jennifer Golinsky-Baseman with the American Gas Association on understanding greenhouse gas emissions from the natural gas value chain. We'll get started here in about 3 minutes. We like to wait, give everybody a chance to get on board. In the meantime, I have sent into the chat a link to the document that Jennifer will be speaking to. So please feel free to go down to the chat there and pick up that. I'm sending it right now. Pick up that link there. That will allow you to download the AGA's report. And I'll remind you of that in a bit. Jennifer, you about ready to get started?
Sure. Do you wanna, are you
Yeah,
good with the number of people we've got locked in?
Yeah, I'll introduce everything and we'll go ahead and get going here. I think we've got
Great.
probably 20 or about 20 people in right now. Others may come in just a minute. So let's go ahead and get started in the interest of everybody's time. So hi, welcome to all of you who are joining us for the September edition of the Northwest Gas Association's monthly webinar series. This month, we're really tickled to host Jennifer Golinsky-Baseman, Associate Counsel for Environment with the American Gas Association. Jennifer is going to be presenting on the work that the AGA has been doing for a whole bunch of years, and I always look forward to it every year coming out, understanding greenhouse gas emissions from the natural gas value chain. So, Jennifer, I'm sure we'll go through what's included in this, and we'll let her do that. In the meantime, I want to just draw your attention to our rules of engagement here on our webinar series. Remember, keep yourselves muted, please, so we can minimize background noise, and use the chat function to ask your questions. So I'll be monitoring the chat function, and I've already mentioned to Jen that I'll wait for her to take a breath if you ask a question, and I'll interject when she takes a breath with your question at that moment. I think Jen would like to engage in an ongoing interaction rather than waiting for the end of her presentation. Hopefully she'll just remind you of that when she gets started. But ask your questions in the chat function and ask lots of questions. That's going to make it all much more interesting. We are recording this and we'll post this webinar to our YouTube channel, which you see the link up there. A whole bunch of all of our webinars that we've hosted to date are up on that channel. You're welcome to go back and look at any of them. This one will probably be posted tomorrow at some point in time. In addition, Jen has generously said we can share her slides with anybody who asks for them. I'd ask you to send myself or Judy Adair an email if you would like to see those slides, and we'll get them out to you afterwards. One last note for you, future webinars, you see up here, obviously we're past September 19th, and that Northwest Natural and Modern Hydrogen webinar will actually be held in February. So we're looking forward to that. In October, we have Artificial Intelligence in the Natural Gas World, and November 21st, Powering Progress by the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America's 2023 Climate Report. So all good information, and we hope you'll join us for that. With that, Jen, I'm going to stop sharing and let you pull up your screen, and we will go from there. Jen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes, I just muted myself right before I answered your question.
Okay,
Yes, we can see your screen.
great. Okay, I just want to find the right place to put this little Zoom thing here. Okay, well, hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Jen Baseman. I'm Associate Counsel for Environment at AGA. I've been with AGA about 14 months or so. I previously came from private legal practice, actually working more on the electric side. So it's been really great to dive in more on the gas side. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you today about AGA's annual summary of EPA's annual greenhouse gas inventory. So I've got, you've got the link in the chat to AGA's report, which we'll be talking about mostly. But first, I wanted to talk to you about what the underlying report is that AGA has evaluated for the natural gas sector. So since the 1990s, the US EPA has developed and published an annual set of emissions of national greenhouse gas emissions, as well as emissions sinks. So when we refer to the inventory, that's what we mean. This large, very large report. All the data is publicly available that accompanies the report. I think it's like a 900-page report. So you see here at the bottom, this is a link to the latest report. I'm kind of trying to circle it here without losing my mouse off the screen. The report, it's the kind of the gold standard of looking at US greenhouse gas emissions. And although from time to time there are issues that AGA has with EPA's methodology, which I'll address a little bit later, we rely on the stats in the inventory. We in fact incorporate some of the methodology and emission factors from the inventory into AGA and the Edison Electric Institute, EEI's joint voluntary disclosure template for methane intensity. That's the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative. I'll talk about that also a little bit later. But the inventory is the kind of the be all end all here. It covers the most important greenhouse gas emissions that are anthropogenic, including as relevant to the natural gas industry, carbon dioxide. Oh, and see something in the chat? Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
Jen,
gonna
I
I'll
just
ignore the
posted
chat so I don't get distracted by it. And I'll let you tell me if there's something I need to see in the chat.
That's exactly how we'll put it together. And for the watchers of the webinar here, I just posted a link to the EPA's GHG emissions inventory webpage where you can download the report itself and see some summary information. So sorry to distract.
And there's also all of the data. Oh, no worries. Easily distracted. The spreadsheets on spreadsheets. There's a ton of stuff there. And what EPA does is puts out a draft report, usually around March or so of every year, accepts comment. It's a quick turnaround time once they put out the draft report and the accompanying data, but accepts comment on it, and then turns the final report around in April every year. And so the report looks back at 1990 through 2 years before the report is issued. So this most recent report from 2024 covers emissions from 1990 to 2022. So sometimes you just have to be careful of someone saying, oh, the 2024 inventory. Other people might say the 2022 inventory, meaning the inventory that covers emissions through 2022, which is this one, which was issued in 2024. So it can be a little confusing, but just make sure you're kind of circling back to see exactly which report is being referenced. EPA also, from year to year, will set out to plan to adjust certain methodology or re-examine something or add an additional set of emission sources. And so going back to essentially like right around now, in advance of the report that they're working on for the coming year, they'll put out some, a few targeted memos on certain areas. So there is opportunity for engagement with this earlier on in the process than just getting that draft report in March, but it's not a comprehensive engagement opportunity quite so early in that process. So EPA reports all greenhouse gas emissions in units of carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e, so that you're able to compare apples to apples when you have a high warming potential pollutant like methane. It doesn't compare apples to CO2 unless you adjust it for the radiative forcing of each individual gas. And so the global warming potential that EPA uses, consistent with the IPCC and the greenhouse gas reporting program under EPA, uses a 100-year time horizon. So when we're looking at numbers here today, we'll mostly be talking about million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, so MMT CO2e.
Jen,
Okay.
I have a
Yeah,
quick question here.
sure.
One, can you talk to me about, or talk to us about perhaps the difference between EPA's GHG inventory and Subpart W reporting, or any interaction between those two things, if any?
Absolutely. There's plenty. And you actually, maybe I accidentally shared my notes to the screen, because that's the next thing I was going to talk about.
Okay, good.
So the data in the greenhouse gas inventory comes in part from the greenhouse gas reporting program, which includes Subpart W. And now I'm wishing that I included a slide from a different presentation that gives more of an overview of that program, but we can talk about that in the absence of slides. So the greenhouse gas reporting program, Subpart W, covering petroleum and natural gas systems, obviously is our bread and butter for the reporting program. The AGA members, and I'm sure NWGA members, also report under Subpart C, which includes combustion data, Subpart NN, which is for suppliers of natural gas and natural gas liquids, and some others depending on what kind of assets you have. The reporting program data is one of the inputs that goes into the inventory. The inventory is also comprised of data and calculation methodologies and emission factors from different studies. And with the reporting program, obviously, if you have errors, you have to go back and make corrections, but you don't go back and revise your previously reported greenhouse gas emissions to EPA if, for example, there's a change in methodology or emission factors have changed, year over year. You kind of just leave it static. Whereas with the greenhouse gas inventory, EPA will go back and recalculate past year's emissions as required based on revised or refined methodology, different emission factors. And EPA is, so you've got the greenhouse gas reporting data, which is just, it's, straightforward, it's reported from these sources. Separately, the reporting data is made publicly available by EPA. But with the inventory, sometimes the methodology, you might have a study that includes emission factors from just a certain set of years, and then that's kind of overtaken by a better study, but it's got some limitations. They essentially will kind of sometimes stitch things together and make reasonable inferences, because what they're looking at is trends. They're not necessarily saying, this is the exact amount of emissions that were emitted and that's that, and move on. They are refining for accuracy, but the whole point of this report is showing trends. So, some questions that we sometimes get at AGA from members when it comes to their own greenhouse gas accounting is, let's say EPA changes emission factors in the reporting program, should we be like going back and adjusting our baseline so that we are comparing apples to apples over a time series? And that's a question, as a side note, for every individual company to deal with, and some jurisdictions have requirements about, how to comprise your baseline, et cetera. That's just an example of some of the differences between the reporting program and the inventory. The inventory might go back and revise, all the way back to the 1990 baseline, or might, revise just a piece. And so the EPA, we kind of are just giving EPA license to adjust in a reasonable manner as the agency deems necessary. But that's the type of thing that you can include in comments if, if EPA proposes to make a revision to a prior year and their methodology just doesn't line up in your opinion, that's something you can say to the agency. Does that get at your question?
It does.
It also reminded me of something that I would be remiss if I did not say. As an attorney, I have to say nothing in this presentation is intended to be legal advice. Please don't rely on it as you would legal advice. If you actually need legal advice on compliance or how any of this affects your own company, you'll need to consult with your own lawyer. And so just like I don't have attorney-client privilege with AGA members, I definitely don't have it with your membership outside of the AGA context. Okay,
Thanks, Jen.
sorry, nerdy lawyer disclaimer, but I always have to make it. So the inventory includes, and the focus of today's presentation is the 6 emission subcategories, 6 segments of natural gas systems. And so in speaking about subpart W, which has 10 different segments defined, we're only talking about 6 under the inventory. So we've got exploration, production, which includes gathering and boosting. It's not separated out. Processing, transmission and storage, distribution, and post-meter emissions. Post-meter is viewed separately from distribution emissions and was only added to the inventory 2 years ago. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just to give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about today, AGA's report in particular goes through the inventory's data and results and analysis, kind of compiles it and distills it down just to not just to focus on natural gas systems broadly, but in particular on the distribution segment, which is the kind of core of AGA's membership. We also talk about post-meter emissions and then some additional information on transmission and storage. That really kind of, we've got members further upstream and different types of vendors who have interests all throughout the value chain, but really the core of AGA's membership is distribution with some transmission and storage assets. So our focus today will be on that. And so here I've got a link to, and it's already in the chat for today's meeting, but this is a link to AGA's full report. And AGA compiles this every year with SLR Consulting, publicly available. You don't need any sort of login or anything. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about economy-wide emissions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, we're kind of just going to go, more and more granular. Then we'll talk about natural gas system emissions, and we'll really focus in on distribution and post-meter emissions. And again, at any point, if you have questions, please do whatever is your normal meeting protocol to announce that you have questions, and I'm very happy to take questions throughout. I also want to say that I am not a statistician, nor am I an engineer. And so to the extent that I'm an environmental lawyer, so if anything comes up that I cannot answer, we'll make a note of it, and I'll definitely get back to you with insight from some of my colleagues who also worked on this report. Okay, so economy-wide emissions. The economy-wide emissions have increased a little bit since the prior year, 2021. It's likely due to the economic rebound from COVID at its height. I don't know about where each of you live, but where I live in the Washington, D.C. area, we were locked down. And so, wasn't using my car and wasn't, going into my office and turning on the lights. And so obviously we're, seeing, as we're seeing an economic rebound, we are seeing a kind of greenhouse gas emission rebound. In 2022, net GHG emissions across the country were 16.5% below 2005 levels. And this is primarily due to, as you know, the shift from coal to natural gas for power generation, as well as the increased use of renewable generation in the power sector. The transportation sector, excuse me, clicked away on my notes. The transportation sector accounted for the largest portion of gross greenhouse gas emissions. The second is electric power generation, and I'll note that the post-meter emissions category does include electric generation. So, those are customers of some of our companies. So it's, although the natural gas industry is not the second largest, natural gas is obviously part of what accounts for the power sector's emissions. Industry generally as a category accounted for the third largest portion. The land use change and forestry sector, due to being a carbon sink, offset of nearly 15% of total emissions in 2002. So what we've got here is a set of graphics representing, carbon dioxide. Everyone knows, well, not everyone, but everyone on this call knows carbon dioxide is the bulk of what we're talking about with greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this is nationally, this is not in the industry specifically. Methane really here, though, is obviously what we're focusing on. So I've made that the largest. And as you'll see here, enteric fermentation, which is essentially cow digestive activity, is slightly higher than natural gas systems in terms of being an anthropogenic source of methane emissions in the US in 2002. Emissions in our sector have decreased a little shy of 21% since 1990, largely due to decreases from the distribution segment and transmission and storage segment. And in distribution, the reductions are mainly due to reducing pipeline and distribution station leaks, and the decrease in transmission and storage emissions due largely to reducing compressor station emissions, including both emissions from compressors and leaks. So let us go to natural gas systems. So I mentioned that we're focusing on our three big natural gas GHGs, largely methane, and we've seen overall a decrease of 17% from 1990 and 0.3% from 2021. This is mostly due to methane decreases, and within that, mostly due to the distribution segment at 70%. So 70% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. That's something that we at AGA like to proudly brag about a lot, because that's a significant change. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, that has occurred while the system has been growing, the natural gas distribution system.
So Jen, I do have
yeah.
just a quick comment here. I think natural gas systems is defined as production, midstream, and distribution. Is that correct?
It is defined as exploration, production, which is also includes gathering and boosting. So exploration, production, processing, transmission and storage, distribution, and post-meter. So
Okay.
six. It's, as you know, it depends on what program you're in as to how your, how the value chain is divvied up. But here we are talking about 6 segments. So the increases, we were talking about the decreases. So processing has accounted for a 37% decrease. Exploration has accounted for a 97% decrease within their segment in terms of methane emissions. What we've seen in terms of increases, onshore production, gathering and boosting, and post-meter emissions. So we are going to visualize that now. There's just this kind of, petering out of a real presence of exploration emissions. I think is pretty interesting. A little blip again here, but obviously we're all well aware of the natural gas boom. The exploration leading up to it, has petered out in terms of the impact of emissions. This is obviously a downward trend over time. It's not as dramatic as what we'll see when we look directly at the distribution segment. And so that's, in an industry that is, methane is essentially the product. We're at AGA, we're certainly very proud of the dramatic decrease that we've seen in methane emissions from distribution. So now we'll visualize numbers. I don't know who's a numbers person and who's, more of a chart-based visual learner. But as you can see here, we've got the dramatic reduction since 1990 spelled out, and a decrease since 1990 of 21%. Not always the most dramatic overall in the industry, and of course the need to voluntarily and from a regulatory compliance perspective do more is always pressing. I think that we're going to start to see from the production side, from processing, gathering and boosting, if the EPA regulations on methane emissions, which don't apply to the distribution segment as that is defined under subpart W, that essentially, past the custody transfer point, but everything upstream of that is subject to the Quad O series of regulations that's currently being challenged in court. But if that does survive, eventually we're going to start to see some dramatic decreases, I think, in methane emissions from further upstream. So that coupled with the methane waste emission charge from the Inflation Reduction Act, the final rule for which we're expecting to see sometime by the end of the year, between the emission reduction regulations and the threat of having to pay the methane fee, which again applies upstream of the distribution segment, but obviously as a connected value chain will have impacts downstream no matter what. We should be looking at a more dramatic decrease. And again, the reports are 2 years out. It's going to take years to comply with these programs, provided that they even survive judicial review. So it's not a certainty that we'll start to see a dramatic drop, but that's the particularly like the methane fee, the Inflation Reduction Act is being hailed as one of the biggest climate investments and most dramatic climate related policies to ever have existed. And so one would expect to start to see a big drop off in these numbers. So
I'm just going to interject.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just really quickly to remind folks, use the chat function to enter any questions you might have. Jen would welcome your questions in the middle of her presentation. So I just wanted to remind folks that that's opportunity available to them.
Thank you. One thing I want to mention before I move on, so we're going to be talking about post-meter emissions, and that category was added to the inventory in 2022, I believe I mentioned, and EPA has added retroactive calculations to account for previous years post-meter emissions. So AGA, again, I mentioned, places a lot of stock in the inventory and uses it as data points when we describe our industry, as inputs in our voluntary reporting templates. However, AGA does believe that EPA kind of moved forward with providing data for and analyzing post-meter emissions without resolving certain data gaps, particularly without resolving significant uncertainties in those data. And so I just kind of want to put like an asterisk on where you see post-meter emissions reported in the inventory, just from AGA's perspective. It's kind of the best we can do right now, but is not going to end up being an accurate portrayal. So we're just kind of not there yet in terms of certainty for that category of emissions. So just, from our perspective, think about post-meter with a bit of an asterisk. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, EPA will seek to refine or revise prior year estimates in subsequent greenhouse gas inventories. The use of better methods or improved data, more certainty in analysis, et cetera. Anything like that can contribute to EPA revising in either direction, upward or downward, the previously reported emissions for particular sources. So this table shows how the most recent inventory treated each of the natural gas systems segments. As you can see, for the segments where there was any change, it was a downward revision. EPA revised these data based on updated methodology of national level activity data, particularly for transmission compressor stations. The CO2 and methane estimates from underground natural gas storage well events, the estimates for emissions from those events occurring over several years in the time series, EPA has revised those down. Transmission pipeline venting emissions of methane are 0.1% lower on average in this inventory than in the prior year's inventory, kind of across the time series. And the methane estimate specifically from transmission pipeline for 2021 is 4% lower than the previous inventory. That's, these are not insignificant downward revisions. Those changes were due in part to revisions that reporters made under the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program and submitted to EPA. So essentially, while you're not going back and like recalculating your emissions generally under the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, those data you can go back and make changes. It's just not the way that the inventory looks back and makes revisions kind of as a matter of course. Typically, you're making just like error corrections in the reporting program. There were, in the 2024 inventory, there were no significant methodological changes for the distribution segment. The same goes for post-meter emissions. Really just, less than 0.1% average decreases across both compared to the prior industry. Some other recalculations included methodological updates to transmission compressor station activity data, completions and workovers, and underground natural gas storage well events mentioned before. Further upstream, updated well counts and production data from just general energy tracking metrics that has gone into this reduction that we've seen from the prior year. And so, yeah, I just note at the bottom of the table, there's independent rounding, so this might not all sum together perfectly. Okay, so now we're going to drill down into distribution in particular, and a little bit on transmission and storage. Within the natural gas distribution segment, we're primarily looking at methane emissions and CO2 emissions, mostly from fugitive emissions from pipelines and from metering regulating stations. This accounts for 9% of the methane emissions from the overall natural gas system category in the inventory, and less than 0.1% of the carbon dioxide emissions from the entire natural gas system are attributed to distribution. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the main cause of improvements for cause of the methane emissions decrease over time in distribution has largely been upgrading kind of legacy pipe, maybe cast iron, unprotected steel to more modern materials like plastic or coated steel that is generally just less leak prone. So those kinds of updates, as well as upgrades at M&R stations, have gone a long way to reducing emissions. So I'm gonna say it again because our AGA CEO loves this stat, and so do we. The methane emissions from the distribution segment in 2022 were 70% lower than in 1990, and then within that, 1% lower than 2021 emissions. The real crux here, and we're going to get into it on the next slide, though, is actually, I'm going to go ahead to the next slide real quick, and then we'll go back to transmission and storage. The number, so the methane emissions over time since 1990 in the distribution segment are essentially inverse to how much the system has grown. So there were over 1.3 million miles of distribution mains in the US in 2022, which since 1990 is a 55% increase in the number in the mileage of distribution pipes. Oh, so a 55% increase in the size of the system, coupled with a 70% decrease in the amount of methane emissions. And so this is really a pretty stunning graph and my favorite in the report for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the first is you're seeing improvements in methane emissions while the system is growing. So then you've also got the fact that the system is growing. There's demand for natural gas. I don't have it here in my notes, but AGA's playbook, which is available online, is a compilation annually of different interesting statistics about the natural gas industry focused on distribution. And I think it's something like once every minute we add a new customer to the system, and like every day 80 commercial customers are added. It's really stunning. Like the drumbeat against natural gas is obviously loud, but we hear from members that potential customers are calling up and saying, expand in my community, come to my neighborhood. That I think that this graph here speaks volumes. So, and the pipeline mileage data is based on PHMSA data from 2022. So now let us go, if I can correctly do this, back and talk a little bit about transmission and storage. Then
we just have a note
yeah.
from Ashley Duckman saying that's the correct stat. So thumbs up on that.
Oh, did I remember? Oh, okay. Hi, Ashley. I didn't know you were on. Yes, when I remember numbers correctly, that's a pretty big victory for me. So I'm not much more comfortable with letters than numbers, just as a whole. It's a good reason to go to law school, to try to stay away from numbers. Okay, so transmission and storage in 2022 accounted for 23% of methane emissions in natural gas systems and 3% of carbon dioxide emissions. As we talked about before, since 1990, methane emissions have gone down by 38%. This is primarily due to reduced pneumatic device and compressor station emissions, including from leaks. So what's interesting here is we have seen an increase in CO2 emissions over time in transmission and storage because LNG terminals are grouped into transmission and storage in this in the inventory in the greenhouse gas reporting program. LNG storage and LNG imports and exports are separate from transmission and as a category, and separate from transmission compression. So seeing this all grouped together, the impact of increased LNG exports as well as flaring related to LNG storage and processing has accounted for an uptick in carbon dioxide emissions, including in just the 1 year from last year's inventory to this year's, a 36% increase in CO2 emissions. It'll be interesting to see with the kind of, pause on LNG export approvals, if there's any sort of dip in the 2023 into 2024 emissions with regard to LNG in a future report. N2O emissions increased 405% from 1990 to 2022, which includes a 177% increase year over year in the most recent inventory. That said, was that a question?
I do have a question from Buddy at Ellensburg. Is any of the forecasted or actual drop in transmission emissions coming from electrifying compression? Do we know?
I am not sure. I'm sure that that's something that most likely is addressed in the inventory itself. As a reminder, everything we're talking about here and all this data is from AGA summary report. But I think that going zero emission compression is something that is relevant in this discussion. I'm pretty sure I've seen it in the past. But if you wouldn't mind making a note of that for me, I can look into it and flag it in the broader inventory report for you.
Got it. Note taken. And I'm just
But
also
I'm
adding,
relatively sure that that's it.
I'm adding a link in the chat to the AGA's playbook website, which
Yeah.
mentioned previously.
Yeah, and there's the playbook itself, and then you can download individual graphics and entire sections of it. We've also got hard copies in AJ's office that we can distribute, but the online version, it's the same information. Okay, so we have already hit this chart, but it's my favorite, so we're just going to briefly look at it again. All right, so getting into distribution segment emission sources. I know it's a little confusing sometimes because we're talking about emission like segments from the natural gas value chain that are, you know, treated as chunks of this report. And then when we talk about emission sources, particularly for someone like me who comes from a clean air background, when I think of an emission source, I'm mostly thinking of like a power plant, you know, something like bigger, like a compressor station. But here, you know, pipeline leaks as a whole are an emission source, and this is the same in subpart W. So that terminology, just to, if anyone else gets caught on it, I understand because I'm similar. So far and away, customer meter methane emissions are the biggest piece of this pie. Emissions from routine maintenance being the smallest. Upsets a pretty big chunk. So, you know, third-party dig-ins, and that's something that, you know, just AGA puts a lot of work into the 811 program and trying to avoid these types of, you know, like excavation damage and whatnot. But regardless of whether you've got, you know, a third party or if it's your own activities that result in a dig-in, that's still attributable to your emissions under the greenhouse gas reporting program. So unfortunately, you can't assign it to the person who messed up and you know, hit your pipeline. So the share of M&R leaks is, you know, I think much lower than you would expect, being a physically larger source. But this is what we're looking at, and as pipe gets replaced with more modern materials, we're going to see that pipeline leak piece continue to decrease. So now we're going to kind of shift distribution into post-meter emissions. Obviously, we've talked about the dramatic decrease over time, the 70% decrease in distribution emissions since 1990. We've seen at the same time a slower uptick, but still an uptick in post-meter emissions. Post-meter emissions, the sub-segments that the inventory uses, residential and commercial, you know, largely appliances, leak emissions from gas-fired furnaces, water heaters, stoves, ovens, barbecues, and grills. Hopefully not a huge portion of that is attributable to when my husband improperly connects our gas grill when we're using that. Then leakage from internal piping at industrial plants and power stations, and natural gas fueled vehicles. So these are releases during fueling and depressurization of high pressure systems. So I want to get back to what we were talking about earlier with the data issues and uncertainty that AGA has identified in the post-meter segment data and calculations. So again, this was added in 2022. The post-meter segment emissions are estimated using activity-based emission factors. AGA has repeatedly requested that EPA postpone fully adding residential post-meter emissions to the inventory because of data gaps and uncertainties that will be resolved, and the gaps will close once further analysis can be developed and applied. In particular, there's no, and these are things that AGA has told EPA in comments and repeatedly in different venues. There's no consensus standard test methods or standard practices for measuring and determining flow rate or volume of methane emissions from end use natural gas appliances. So there's differences in the type of measurement equipment used, performance related attributes of the equipment, standardization issues that really haven't been addressed in EPA's activity-based emission factors and resulting data. AGA believes that those should be addressed before using any one study for these types of methane emissions. It would take a lot of time, but it's essential to be able to make these credible emissions of credible estimates for post-meter emissions of methane. Another piece is that the emission factors were developed from a really small set of studies with a limited sample of homes. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe this was a study in California, which, you're not going to compare California to Nebraska to Florida. I mean, it's not going to be representative of a national estimate. There's also major differences, data gaps, as I mentioned, differences, order of magnitude differences across the available studies. EPA essentially reviewed several studies, but relied just on the one California study that I mentioned to pull those emission factors. There haven't been repeated tests to determine reproducibility of the methods that were referenced, or seeing whether emissions vary with time or environmental conditions like seasonal temperature and weather changes. And then finally, EPA's time series doesn't represent or doesn't reflect the phase out of pilot lights for many natural gas appliances. And, over the past, decade to few decades with the Department of Energy's appliance efficiency standards, pilot lights have largely been phased out in natural gas appliances, and that's not reflected in EPA's estimates. That said, this is still the kind of, best national estimate that exists, but not that it's necessarily something that AGA would prefer, but this is what we have. So the post-meter emission factors, because they were just added in 2022, added in the 2022 inventory. So that would be starting, in the year 2020. The emission factors have held constant so far, with EPA's couple of inventories that have been issued since they first added post-meter emissions. So that's held constant. The post-meter emissions segment accounted for about 8%. Methane emissions from the post-meter segment accounted for about 8% of overall emissions from natural gas systems in 2022. We're looking at a 65% increase since 1990 and a 3% increase from 2021 due to 2022. And that is due to increases in the number of residential houses using natural gas and increased consumption at industrial facilities and power plants. Overall, post-meter CO2 emission account for less than 0.01% of total natural gas system carbon dioxide emissions. So what I'm going to get into now is, and this, by the way, is my final substantive slide. I want to just point out that the report includes a calculation of methane intensity relative to natural gas throughput. And this is based on and so now, we're looking at distribution and post-meter together. These calculations are based on the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative, which I talked about a little bit earlier. That is AGA and EEI's joint initiative to offer our members and the general public, whether or not you're a member of either trade association, the ability to calculate and voluntarily report your methane intensity. The way that it's done is there are 5 segments currently represented, and you can compare company to company using the template, or within your own operations, but you can't compare like gathering and boosting to distribution. It's just not set up that way yet. And so what I've got here at the bottom, you can see is the for transmission and storage, distribution, and post meter. This is the calculation used to evaluate methane intensity. Actually, I should have included this. If Daniel, if you make a note, I'd like to also circulate the NGSI webpage. AGA and EEI just completed an update to the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative, which constitutes version 2. There are some kind of substantive tweaks, but this is largely a kind of clarification and improvement of the user experience. And we're going to be looking toward, through the next year, updating the NGSI protocol and templates again to account for the recent revisions to subpart W of the greenhouse gas reporting program. So right now, the available template is, greenhouse gas reporting program, subpart W as it currently stands. And then starting it for reporting year 2025, we're going to have developed an update that incorporates not just the subpart W changes, but also changes from an April final rule that was essentially updating, every other subpart except for subpart W, which included adding, I think it was 5 additional subparts. So that's really everything I had planned to talk about today. Got this little happy slide for questions, but I actually wanted to point out the first 2. So my contact information is at the bottom. The first 2 contacts are the primary kind of shepherds of this report, my colleagues at AGA, Morgan and Richard. So you're free to reach out to any of us, but the more technical or statistically, mathematically related your question, the more likely I am to refer it to Morgan and Richard. So with that, I haven't left a ton of time for questions here, but I'm happy to take any questions you have, revisit any slides you'd like to see. And as we mentioned earlier, the slides will be available for you after this presentation.
Yeah, Jen, could you go back to the substantive slide while we're waiting? Please enter any questions you might have for Jennifer in the chat. And I do have a question on that last slide.
The methane intensity.
The
yes.
methane.
Oh, you know what? I just clicked back to it on my own screen and not for you guys. Okay,
there you go.
Here it is for you.
Yeah. So is this the number, if you add the methane intensity percentage column up, it adds up to 1.48%. Is that the number that relates to that? Gosh, if it's more than 3%, it's worse than coal. Is that number?
I do not know the answer to that question specifically, but I will say that based on how we have NGSI set up for public use, it's not intended currently with the methodology that we have in there. It's not intended to sum all of these numbers. Right. You've got, you're looking at distribution separately from, so, and then also this is natural gas system overall. So this is also not adding all of these together. Some of these, when you have post meter, you've also got residential, commercial, industrial, like this is not, this column here is not kind of all in the same.
So it might be the natural gas system overall, that top line there of 0.81% is what actually compares to the 3% is worse than coal numbers. I don't know. That might be worth just clarifying and following.
That in the list that I appreciate that you're making for me. I'll definitely check with Morgan and Richard on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because my familiarity is more with NGSI, and we're very clear about how it's not used to sum across segments, just kind of comparing within one segment. But yeah, we'll chat about that and get back to you.
Okay. All right. Any questions? I'll give you just one more beat while I remind people that on October 17th from noon to 1 p.m. Pacific time, we will have our October edition of the Northwest Gas Association's webinar series. And again, we'll be featuring the American Gas Association talking about artificial intelligence in the natural gas system. And we're looking forward to that and hope you
I
will
can
join.
assure you, I am not the presenter for that because I
I
know
think you,
I'm the
I think
last person. If there's like a line of people who are subject matter experts on AI stuff, I'm at the end of the line.
Okay, so I do have another question.
Sure.
I have a clarification from Bill Donahue that said this is methane only and not CO2e. Yeah, I think that's actually what that 3% includes, Bill, but thank you for that.
Is
And
that
then a
your methane
question,
intensity?
yeah, and then a question from Jana. Can you explain post meter and what that includes?
Essentially, it's let me go back to so post meter emissions essentially once the natural gas leaves the local distribution company and is like essentially in the custody of the customer. So, we're LDCs are not able to, or not accountable, I should say, for methane. Like, for example, I had a contractor incorrectly reinstall my gas stove after some repairs were done, and we had a leak. It was very minor, and while I did call the gas company, it's not their responsibility to um, make sure nobody has appliance leaks in their home. So they come out rapid response, but then I'm responsible for calling a plumber and getting that fixed and paying whatever huge amount of money I paid just to have a valve tightened, because it wasn't a structural problem with the appliance. So we're looking at once the gas is in the hands of the customer.
Okay. Well,
And
with
so yeah,
that,
post meter being everything after the customer's meter. So more like
here's
meter to
yeah,
burner tip.
yeah, here's Ashley Duckman's formal definition. Post-meter
Yes.
segment methane emissions are associated with equipment owned and operated by consumers and include emissions from residential and commercial appliances, industrial facilities and power plants, and natural gas fueled vehicles.
Thank you,
So
Ashley.
that's what's in there. Thank you, Ashley.
Great.
I think that's all we have. So I know I am representing everybody on the call here. Jen, when I say thank you very much for your time,
Absolutely.
give our thanks to Morgan and Richard for continuing to develop this terrific resource for AGA members and educational resource. Please, all y'all, do let us know if you'd like a copy of the slides. Remember that the webinar will be on our posted webinar recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, probably tomorrow. And yeah, let us know if you'd like a copy of the slides, which Jen will be providing to me shortly. So in the meantime, we look forward to seeing you on October 17th for our next webinar, AI in Natural Gas. And we thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.